What's going on, everybody? You know, one of the most interesting times in the Sega Master System's life would come after the release of the Genesis. As you guys know, Sega would try to actually revitalize the system in North America, where it just failed absolutely horribly. In doing so, it basically picked up the entire personality of the Sega Genesis. It was getting most of the ports and most of the home games that the Sega Genesis was getting. They would just be in 8-bit form. Some of these games would go on to be, as you know, absolutely terrible. But some of these games would actually be pretty good. And we're going to take a look at some of those games right now. Let's take a look. Shortly after the release of the Mega Drive in Japan, Sega would release a port of Altered Beast for its new 16-bit powerhouse. While certainly not arcade perfect, it was a remarkably close conversion of a game that was just released in the arcade mere months before. It was colorful, had great music, and a fun 2-player mode. Trying to revitalize the failing Master System in North America, while keeping the momentum going strong in Europe, Sega would port Altered Beast to the Sega Master System in 1989 as well. The game suffered a massive downgrade in graphical assets, with a major hit in color, frame rate, and animation. The music also took a hit, lacking any of the punch of its Mega Drive big brother. The worst offense would come in the poor gameplay, however. The game was slower, had poor hit detection, and was now only one player. None of this was the fault of the hardware, as there are Sega Master System games with much better music, graphics, and gameplay. Being half the size of the Mega Drive version was no doubt a factor, and the end result is a disappointing game that did not do the arcade original any justice at all. In fact, of the games you'll see in this episode, it is by far my least favorite. The game is pretty inexpensive though, with card-only eBay listings often going for under $10. Ghouls and Ghosts would see a release on the Genesis right around the system's official North American launch in 1989. It garnered immediate praise for its graphics and sound, again boosting the system's reputation as a place for great arcade ports. It set an immediate standard for 16-bit presentation, and games would be compared to it for well into the year after its release. This was also especially impressive given the game's meager size of only 5 megabits. The following year, Sega would release the game on the Sega Master System. This one, of course, has the expected visual downgrades, but where this one succeeded where Altered Beast failed was holding on to the core gameplay. It scrolls well, jumps well, and has solid hit detection, and even holds on to the large bosses. The game also managed to add a few more power-ups you can get to help you along the way, as well as allowing you to continue in places that makes the game less frustrating for the average player. It was a very decent version of the game, and one that is worth owning on the machine. The North American version of the game is rare and expensive, often going for well over $100 complete. Sega's big strategy early in the life of the Genesis was to establish it as the go-to machine for big arcade releases. Strider would be licensed from Capcom and internally developed at Sega, and man, what a port it was. The 8 megabit cart captured the look and feel of the arcade game, which itself was only released the previous year. It was a killer app for the machine, and a showpiece that helped Sega immediately establish the Genesis as a must-have piece of hardware. Looking to capitalize on the license and the success of the 16-bit release, Sega would commission UK developer Tiertex to port the game to the Sega Master System. They would attempt to take the arcade game and shrink it down into a cartridge half the size of the 16-bit release. The result was a game that was nowhere near as pretty, but surprisingly not bad at all. The sprites were smaller and had less animation, and the music would be heavily cut back, but still retain the feel of the original. For all intents and purposes, it had most of what was in the arcade version. The lone area of disappointment would come in the copious amounts of slowdown the engine would have. Certain areas suffered extreme amounts, with sprite flicker intruding fairly often as well. Still, it played well enough, and kept enough of the arcade's content to be a worthy addition to Sega's 8-bit library. Again attempting to leverage its recent arcade games on its new 16-bit console, Sega would launch Golden Axe on the Genesis in late 1989. This was a mere 7 months after the arcade version, further adding to the machine's reputation of getting great arcade ports really fast. While only being 4 megabits and having a number of cutbacks from the arcade, it was a faithful port that played and sounded great. Its 2-player mode was the stuff of legends, and the added level and end-boss extended the gameplay past the arcade original. Around the same time, Sega would release the Sega Master System version, a cartridge that would be shockingly the same size as the 16-bit version. Here, we'd get large characters, decent animation, music that kept the feel and atmosphere of the original, and most of the stages and bosses intact. The game was also much faster than the 16-bit version, both in character movement and attacks. If things had remained equal from there, this would have been an awesome 8-bit port of the arcade. Unfortunately, things weren't equal, and we'd see a number of cuts. First, the 2-player co-op mode is completely gone, taking with it a major selling point of the original. It also lost 2 of the 3 playable characters, now only allowing you to play as Axe Battler. You do get the choice of all 3 characters' magic attacks, but it's a poor substitute for the characters themselves. This one still plays well enough to recommend, but it's a shadow of the original arcade and Genesis versions without the co-op and all the characters. Castle of Illusion would be one of the best surprises on the Genesis early in its life. Its combination of great graphics, smooth gameplay, and lighthearted fun showed that the machine wasn't just going to be for arcade ports, but awesome exclusive content as well. With its critical and commercial success, it was no wonder Sega had an 8-bit version in the works for the Sega Master System and Game Gear. The biggest surprise here would be Sega was not looking to simply strip down and port the 16-bit game, but instead opted to build the game from the ground up as its own experience. Level design was radically altered, and even the gameplay would see significant changes and additions to the Genesis formula. The result was a truly fantastic game that was every bit as good as the 16-bit version, and stood on its own as a must-have game. Another big surprise was that Sega managed to do all this in a mere 2 megabit cartridge, providing animation, color, and music well beyond other games twice its size. The game is also quite affordable, and can be gotten for under $30 quite often. This one here is one of the Sega Master System's best platformers, and even if you own the 16-bit version, I highly recommend you get this one as well. It's a rare instance in which the Sega Master System stood toe-to-toe with its bigger brother. Dynomite Duke would hit the Mega Drive in 1990, and was a third-person action shooting game. The gameplay was similar to other gun games like Operation Wolf, but also had your character on screen so you could manually dodge attacks and melee attack at will. It was based on the arcade game of the same name, licensed by Sega. It wasn't the best looking or the best playing game, but it hit the platform at the perfect time and was different enough from the other stuff to warrant some attention. Right around the same time, Sega would develop a Sega Master System version of the game. This version actually looks and plays a lot better than I was expecting. The gameplay remains smooth, and the graphics are colorful and easy on the eyes. The lone disappointment came with the awful soundtrack, which included long periods of high-pitched music that was nearly intolerable. It's also shorter than both the arcade and Mega Drive versions, so you'll beat this one in no time at all. Still, it's a decent experience on the Sega Master System, and can often be scored really cheap at under $20. Sega would join forces with Michael Jackson in 1989, and together they would design Moonwalker, a platforming action game in which the star must rescue kidnapped children. If you were alive in the 1980s, you know the star power of Michael Jackson was huge, and Sega leveraged this behind its new 16-bit machine. This was nothing new for Sega, as they were also grabbing up sports icons like Joe Montana, Pat Riley, and Arnold Palmer to push their software. The gameplay here is simple. Search for children while dispatching the thugs holding them. The game itself was pretty straightforward, but with Michael Jackson's music and influence on the design, it was a strangely unique piece of software. Sega wasn't going to let the Moonwalker license go to waste, so they would design an 8-bit version for the Sega Master System as well. While using the same basic design philosophy as the 16-bit version, the Sega Master System game would feature different stage layouts and was noticeably more difficult. The graphics and sound were faithful to the Genesis version, despite being only a 2 megabit cart, and the game played well overall. This one is a neat piece of Sega's history, capitalizing what Sega was trying to do in the West with celebrity branding. There was meant to be a sequel to these games in 1993, but child molestation charges against the singer quickly squashed the game in development. North American versions of the game tend to be high at $40 or more, but the PAL versions are much cheaper. There is also an isometric arcade version of the license done by Sega, so be sure to check that out on Main. Mike Tyson was defeated by James Buster Douglas in one of history's biggest upsets in boxing. Sega would swoop in quickly and pick up the boxer's license, adding it to an already released Japanese Mega Drive game, Final Blow, which was a port of the arcade game by Taito. Nintendo had long been associated with Mike Tyson, so upon his defeat, Sega seized the opportunity to cash in on the publicity and include Buster Douglas among their new stable of celebrities pushing the Genesis and Mega Drive brands. It was not a particularly good game, with gameplay that was often over in seconds, with out-of-the-blue knockouts that could take an entire life bar. Buster Douglas was also the only real boxer in the game, with few choices beyond that. It was visually impressive, however, with massive characters that filled the screen and truly looked the part of an arcade conversion. Sega wouldn't let the Master System go without its new celebrity endorsement, quickly releasing the game alongside a new model of the Sega Master System. It would take major hits in presentation, with much smaller characters, losing the visual appeal that had been so strong in the 16-bit release. The old saying, "Don't judge a book by its cover," definitely applies here, however, because it's an infinitely better playing game. While still not anything great, there is much more strategy to the gameplay, and you'll need to work a little harder for a KO. It has a level up system in place where each win allows you to add points to your stats and improve your skills. Because Buster Douglas would be destroyed in his very next fight against Evander Holyfield, Sega quickly dropped his likeness from the game, releasing it elsewhere in the world within their own series of boxing games known as Heavyweight Champ. The North American release would go on to be extremely rare, fetching hundreds of dollars for a complete version. Sega was also looking to bring original movie tie-ins to the Genesis, and would start with one of Sega of America's first original games, Dick Tracy. This side-scrolling action game would have both foreground and background enemies you would need to deal with. Enemies on your path could be dispatched with melee attacks and your pistol, while background enemies needed to be dealt with your machine gun. Finding a balance was key, as the machine gun would root your character, not allowing you to dodge while firing. There were also car chase scenes and target practice bonus stages. It has numerous problems, but was a good-looking game that didn't play too bad at all. Right around the same time, the Sega Master System version would see a release. It followed in the 16-bit version's footsteps very closely, both in gameplay and level design, virtually encompassing all the positives and negatives of that release. It's very visually appealing, with great color and animation, especially for a mere 2 megabit cart. The positives in gameplay follow the 16-bit release as well, with both foreground and background enemies, and the game plays very solid. The melee segments feel cheap and repetitive, however, and these stages become the sole areas of true frustration. It's an overall decent showing on both machines, but there are much better games out there. We'll wrap up this selection of games with Sega's Blue Blur, Sonic the Hedgehog. As you guys know, this game exploded onto the scene in the summer of 1991 and shot the Genesis to stardom that year. It drew in gamers by the millions and was Sega's all-purpose weapon against Nintendo and its Mario juggernaut that had ruled the 8-bit landscape with an iron fist. It is inarguably one of the era's most played and popular games. With that said, it was absolutely no surprise that Sega would bring the game out in 8-bit form for its Sega Master System and Game Gear lines. I had pretty much expected a straight port of the Genesis game in level design and gameplay. While it did take the basic fundamentals, it's actually quite a different game overall. Stages are vastly different in design and layout, and there's a few gameplay differences like the inability to recollect dropped coins that really impact the way you approach things. On the flip side, it remained visually appealing, with good color usage and animation. Even the music retained that Sonic high-tempo feel and pace, and although the gameplay wasn't as fast as the Genesis version, it still moved at a fair clip for an 8-bit game. It's definitely a piece of software that stands on its own, and is worth looking at. The US version of the game is very rare, and can go for more money than it's worth. I highly recommend that you score a PAL version, as it plays fine on an NTSC system. For those of you with the interest, Sonic 2 appeared on the machine as well, again radically changing the level design and stages. It's another decent game for the machine that tends to go for under $30 complete. You know, I'll never forget when Sega re-released the Master System in North America. There was this huge commercial push behind it. It was a new model of the machine coming out, and games were just $20 and $30 a piece. And I remember thinking, man, the Master System is really gonna be a success. And boy, did it fail again. It dropped out of retail, I would say within the first year in most places where I lived at, and it made collecting for that really difficult, man, because these games just disappeared, and a lot of these games' US versions would go on to become very expensive. As a matter of fact, that James Buster Douglas that you saw in this episode, I've seen that thing sell for nearly $1,000 complete men in box, and that is just crazy for that kind of game. People call those games holy grails. I think that is a misnomer if there's ever been one. A holy grail should be something that you actually want, other than for the money. I mean, it can still be rare and the money is nice, but shouldn't it be a good game too? How can a bad game be a holy grail? Anyway, I'm Sega Lord X. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.